arguing about this for 4, 5, 6 years,
Yeah.
and the chances of our coming up with anything, especially new, are small.
Yeah. That's one of the respects in which I think it is sort of an unarguable issue. Now,
Yeah.
You know, the issues have just, one has been over them over and over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. But there are perhaps certain aspects of the quarrel in Vietnam that touch especially on your thesis and your concern and the whole nature of it. And that is the suspicion that some people have of a double standard, of selective indignation. For instance, you refer to the heroic Vietnamese resistance to American power.
I think it's absolutely heroic.
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
Amazing.
Now, I understand enough about language to understand the use of heroism in that way.
If you notice, there are a few lines below I say, or above I say something about quite apart from any question of politics.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Right. Now, suppose I were to write about the heroic resistance of the Nazis to the Liberation Army, for instance, their use of torture, the use of mass reprisals.
I don't consider that heroic.
Well, why
at
isn't
all.
that heroic? I mean, that means that they were doing everything they possibly could.
No, I don't think that heroism
not?
doesn't. Well, then I think we do disagree on the use of language.
But
I don't think that reprisals against
we do know that
innocent
Viet Cong
populations
have used fire weapons to destroy whole villages, children, that they have disemboweled mayors and so on and so forth and hung them up and all that kind of stuff. Now, this is heroic, I understand.
No, that is not.
Oh.
That's depraved.
That's depraved.
In my opinion. Yeah.
So
but that's very, very marginal in Viet Cong.
Well, why is it marginal?
In fact, it's marginal. That's a question of fact. And
It's a question of fact, yeah.
The question, in fact, you know, it's quite, you know, I think there's perfect unanimity about this in the people who've studied it. For example, if you look at someone like, say, Douglas Pike, you know, the American Foreign Service agent, as the chief expert on the Viet Cong, and you read his book carefully, you discover that he points out that it was in response to the American military effort that the Viet Cong turned from their attempt to build mass popular support by through the organizational methods that involved giving people an actual role in organizing and controlling their own society and institutions. They turned from that to physical force in reaction to the American intervention. And if you read, I have many examples of this quoted in the book from aid documents, let's say, or from pacification manuals where people point out...
By the same token, you can say that the Nazis turned to torture in France in reaction to Eisenhower's landing in Normandy. The answer is that people so disposed to act are certain kinds of people, and I yearn for a recognition of this in your writings or in Douglas Pike's. As a matter of fact, Douglas Pike, as you know, has certain difficulty with the fact that it is acknowledged that up to 25,000, 30,000 people were individually killed by terrorists before.
When was that?
America's, it was between 1958 and 1962.
I think a 9,000 is the figure that's given usually.
Well,
right, and it's interesting to see what it was. I mean, if one really wants to talk about Viet Cong terror during the period prior to the American intervention, then again, I think just about all commentators, Dennis Warner, Bernard Fall, whoever you like, has agreed that by and large, this was terror directed extremely selectively against oppressive and external village officials.
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective.
Pardon?
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective, too.
But I think
the point is, it was intended to establish a universal point.
It was
so
intended
was the execution
to...
of Eichmann selective.
Well, but you see, there's a very big difference. I think, you see, if you want to... personally, I'm against all kinds of terror, no question. But if you want to understand the Viet Cong situation, then let's recognize a very great distinction, at least I recognize. Let's see what the political point of the terror was. See, after all, during that period, there were about 9,000 or 10,000, according to American sources, there were maybe 9,000 or 10,000 village officials of one sort or another killed by the Viet Cong, largely with the support of the villages. That's what. But at the same time, recall that there were perhaps 160,000 Vietnamese, if we accept Bernard Fall's figures again, killed by the Saigon government and the Americans. This is prior to 1965. That was a very different kind of terror, both in quantity and also in its political content.
Yeah, I know, but it seems to me that you are attempting here to match things which are not equal.
No, 9,000 and 160,000 are no means equal, nor is the political point.
I need to say that I'm prepared to answer. My point is that one presumably distinguishes between an act of terrorism, which you called depraved a moment ago, and
well, what you described, like burning a village, is depraved.
Yeah, a military action
which is equally
part
depraved,
of military operation.
which is even more depraved. For example, you see, well, let me give you some examples of what I consider depraved actions. Malcolm Brown, back in 1962 or 3, I don't remember, reported, it was, I think, AP or UP correspondent, reported that Saigon officials were sending American Skyhawks, airplanes over Vietnamese villages to wipe them out with napalm raids in order to cover instances of graft, for example. Well, that's, I think, depraved. Incidentally, I don't condemn that because, you see, just to mention this matter of double standard, there are really three kinds of terror in Vietnam. There's Viet Cong terror, there's the Saigon government terror, and there's American terror. And if you read what I've written, I say practically nothing about either Viet Cong terror or terror carried out by the Saigon government. Now, if one wanted to talk about that, one would have to point out that the terror carried out by the Saigon government is incredibly greater in extent and has a very different political purpose, which one could discuss. But I restrict myself to discussing American terror.
On that generality, but I gather that you believe it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do, and we could, that then does become a matter of fact, which one could discuss. Yeah, but I, as a matter of principle, almost restrict myself to the discussion of American terror. Not the terror carried out by the various sides in Vietnam, for many reasons. For one thing, because it's just qualitatively different in scale, and for another thing, because I feel that we have some responsibility for it. See, I don't. In the same sense, I don't talk about, I've never written about the terror carried out by both sides in Nigeria, let's say. I don't like it, obviously, but I don't see any point in my giving them good or bad marks for it. On the other hand, if we were carrying out the terror, I would very definitely write about it. And I think, so there's no double standard as far as I can see. At least, let's say I have a standard in mind, one may or may not accept it.
We will explore that.
Okay.
Mr. Chomsky, we were talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them.
That's right.
For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it. Mm. Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world. What period
do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Well, right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported
but not
them.
Sufficiently. Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
but that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual
distinction.
well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared
distinction.
to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material
I'm
interest.
not interested in the mathematics, but I'm interested.
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
Okay.
But
All right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions. I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great mass of cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there's pure predatory imperialism. No, not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
And
we're in the mainstream of imperialism.
The
pure predatory imperialism?
Sure, the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take more. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well, you know, if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Well, for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to
the Greeks
develop an
benign. I think the
Greek situation was benign, not at all. We were
I
trying
say
to...
the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony?
The testimony
of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and...
well, I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were...
there again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of... under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime, which we instituted in 1946, and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romantic, I would say, because
the
number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists. Add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis
communist
in Greece?
Insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the Civil War of the early 40s.
My point is that
the Greeks...
your history is quite confused there. There was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledge that we bailed them out.
Who is they? Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all. Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was... and I'm
talking about Andrea, which makes it even...
Is Andreas Papandreou...
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
In that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights,
and
which gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They did.
If you consider this is...
Because we didn't intervene on the basis...
the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
There
that.
are certain interests that were involved in our